Alright guys, we're going to jump right in with Chapter 1, Communicating at Work, in our Communication at Work text. And this chapter is just kind of an overview to set the foundation for the chapters to come. So we'll talk about the communication model, several elements of communication, formal and informal communication, all that good stuff. So we'll get started here with the importance of communication. And our first bullet says it's important in all jobs. So I like to think of jobs in terms of our lifestyle, right? So communication is going to be very imperative in the success of our friendships, our family relationships, romantic relationships, and with our coworkers, right? And while the skills that we're going to learn in this textbook and this course will largely apply to the communication context in terms of work and our professional career, I think some of these skills are really going to cross over well into other types of relationships and be very useful throughout your life and in various stages. So the second bullet says leads to promotability. So our ability to communicate well allows us to climb up that ladder more quickly than others that might struggle a bit with communication. So if you are able to communicate your value to a company and your skill set to a company, you're likely going to land a specific job, right? And then if you show that you can accomplish tasks and that you're very value added, that you work well with others, that you can help others, you respect superiors, acknowledge and really listen to maybe somebody that's under you in the company, you're going to get promoted faster and you'll be very successful. That goes into our third point, adds to success. So just being able to communicate well really leads to kind of that extra piece that separates maybe one individual from another in the workplace. Fourth here, it says in top 10 qualities or skills wanted by employers. And guys, I would argue that this is even top 3. So there's rarely any job description you will see where one of the qualifications is not something dealing with communication. So typically one of the top 3 things is strong verbal and written communication skills, right? So you will always see something along those lines within those first few qualifications of a job. Okay guys, so here talking about the nature of communication. You've likely seen this process of communication and this model in public speaking, but noting here guys that this bubble we refer to as the communicator for this class, and you've likely seen it as like the sender or the source, and this one being the receiver, okay? So we combine those terms kind of under an umbrella of communicator because we know that we are sending and receiving messages simultaneously, right? Communication is a process. It's not an act. It's not linear like a message goes sender to receiver, right? We know that as we're sending a message, our receiver might be shaking their head, yes, they might be frowning, confused, and you know you need to clarify, right? So communicators, we are all communicators all the time in every situation, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. We know that the communicator over here that sends and receives, so if you are the one sending a message at that time, say verbally sending a message, you know you have to encode, so put what's in your brain into words to send to this person who is then decoding both what you verbally say and your nonverbals, while you are simultaneously over here as the sender decoding their nonverbals perhaps, right? So this is a very complicated process, and if you just think about it kind of as like a transaction of information where you're sending and receiving messages concurrently, I think that's helpful. I give the example in public speaking as you go to the ATM and you put your card in the ATM, right? And you're punching in all of your information and selecting how much cash you want, for instance, while the machine itself is doing all these calculations and accessing your account, all that good stuff, right? So you are doing something at the same time that the machine is doing something. So you're getting a transaction, right? So it's a simultaneous process. Okay, and we know that we're sending a message. Our message might be verbal, nonverbal, and it's going through a channel. So we can have channels such as social media, so Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, right? We can have face-to-face communication, which is the richest form of communication because we have all those nonverbals and verbals put together in one communication context, right? We might have FaceTime, we might have email, we might send snail mail letters, right? So that channel, the way we send our message, the vehicle of the message, really might impact the encoding and decoding, which again we'll talk about here in a second. We also have this noise up here, guys, and we talk about external and internal noise. And our text refers to external noise as environmental noise. And then we have two types of internal noise, physiological and psychological. So external noise, environmental noise, being maybe someone's mowing the lawn outside your window, maybe someone's chomping their gum next to you and it's distracting you, tapping their pen, something along those lines, okay? Psychological noise, internal noise, might be you're sad about something, you're happy about something, you're stressed out about your next exam. So it's stuff that's weighing heavy on your mind. Okay, and then we have physiological noise, which might be that you're hungry, you stubbed your toe, you're really tired, things that are affecting your body, right? Okay, guys, so we'll talk more about about how these elements really fit into the communication process in terms of different types of relationships and things along those lines. Here we'll talk about communication context. So we know that all of this happens within a communication context, right? And that context can influence how we send this message, the channels that we choose, the noise that might impact it, right? Okay, so we know the process of communication can happen in various contexts that can have a great influence on the effectiveness of the message, right? So for instance, we'll talk about the physical context. So maybe you're sitting quietly in your office with a coworker working on a problem. Maybe your boss has requested that you attend a meeting with him or her in their office to discuss the problem. How does that change the communication situation? Maybe you're in a large convention, or you're in a large board meeting where a bunch of people are talking and throwing out suggestions. How does that influence the communication context, right? Then thinking about social. So maybe you are friends with your coworkers and you go out after work. How does that change your communication? Maybe you are at a business Christmas party. How does that change your social communication, right? And then chronological, guys, thinking in terms of time. Are you chatting in the morning? Are you chatting in the evening? Are you chatting over lunch? How might that change your communication? Do you have history with a person dating back to high school, maybe 5 years ago? Have there been problems in the past? Have you been great friends in the past? How does that influence your communication? And then cultural, guys. Cultural is a big one, and even more so as our communication becomes more and more global. So are there barriers in your cultural communication? Might a certain channel work better in your cultural communication? So always analyzing and thinking about your audience in this situation at hand in terms of structuring your message. Alright, so now we'll talk about some communication principles. And first of all, we know that communication is unavoidable. Whether we know it or not, like it or not, communication is unavoidable. We are always communicating. So for instance, we might be communicating verbally, we might be sending nonverbal messages. Even our absence and our presence sends a message. So maybe you were expected to attend an event and you didn't. What kind of message does that send? Maybe you show up somewhere where people didn't necessarily expect you to be. That might be a very positive message, or in some instances a negative message, right? So always thinking about how we present ourselves and what messages we may or may not be sending, both intentionally and unintentionally. And again, this operates on two levels, largely with verbal and nonverbal communication. Also here, it's important to point out that communication is irreversible. So we've all had those times where we really just wish we would have stuck our foot in our mouth and avoided saying something to someone else, right? We know that we just can't take it back. So once something is said, it's out there for the world to hear, right? Even in social media where we think we can just take our posts down, it's out into the World Wide Web, right? We don't know where it's been. So we always want to be very conscious of what we're saying and have a purpose with everything we say, thinking about the tone that we present with our message, the context. So you have to think about the communication process and the communication climate really holistically, as we know that it's irreversible, both in print and in verbal communication, right? It's also important to note that communication is not an act. It's not something that we just do, right? It's a process. So we are always, again, sending and receiving those messages. And then here we have communication is not a panacea. So it's not a heal-all, right? So we always think that we can, or not always, but sometimes think that we can talk ourselves out of any situation. And yes, it's true that you might be able to smooth things over with a conversation or a chat, but knowing, again, you can't take things back, and there's some things that we just might not be able to heal, right? So again, being very conscious, knowing that communication might help us in some situations, but it's largely never going to just make a blank slate. It's not a panacea, it's not a heal-all. Okay, so now we'll talk about the various channels that we can use when we communicate. First of all, talking about face-to-face communication, the richest form of communication, right? We can judge maybe how fast someone is talking, how long they pause, their nonverbals, how they correlate with their verbals, all of those things. So it's the richest form of communication. It's a synchronous form of communication, meaning that everything happens in real time, right? You're communicating back and forth equally in that moment, right? And then we have asynchronous communication, which means there might be a bit of a delay between the sender and the receiver's response, sending the message and the receiver's response, okay? So that might be telephone and voicemail. So telephone, if you're actually on the phone with them right then, is synchronous communication, right? If you have to leave a voicemail, then that then makes it asynchronous communication because you are waiting for that response. And obviously, guys, when we're on the old school telephone, right, we're losing some of the richness there because we're lacking that face-to-face communication. All we're getting is the audio. So we can still judge tone, pauses, those sorts of things, but we don't get to couple it with our nonverbals. Teleconferencing and video conferencing kind of bridges the gap between the two, okay? So we're still that synchronous communication, real time, and then with video conferencing, you're still kind of getting that face-to-face communication, right? But again, it's still not as rich. It's not the real thing of being face-to-face, sitting right in front of someone, having a conversation, right? And then email and written communication. So email is asynchronous, right? We're waiting for a response, though emails are getting faster and faster and faster. We're relying on them much more for more immediate communication. Written communication can be snail mail, kind of tying into emails. We obviously write those emails, type them out, right? Announcements, those kinds of things, all written communication. Going off of that, there's characteristics of written communication. So it is permanent, right? Once it's written down, it's kind of set in stone. You have a record of that communication. It might be easier to understand because you have that record to go back and review. You can compose it in advance, so you can carefully choose your wording, your phrasing. You can take your time. It doesn't have to be like someone's waiting for you to respond face to face, right? So you might be able to type out a draft and then come back to it later and double check yourself. You're less prone to errors because you have that ability to go proofread, right? And so that's kind of the benefits of written communication, but knowing it might be a little bit slower. You have to wait for that response, give the other person, the receiver, the same benefit of being able to carefully structure their message as well. So in choosing your communication channel, in the modern world, we have so many options as to how we choose to communicate with one another. So in choosing your channel, consider the desired tone. So for instance, if you want to break up with your significant other, I would hope you would not send them a text message. What kind of desired tone, or what kind of tone does that send them? It's likely not the desired tone, right? You want some face-to-face, show that you care, kind of communication there. Sending a text message kind of takes the person out of the message and it's just words. So think about that desired tone. Consider an organization's culture. So maybe you are in a very relaxed professional environment where sending a text to your coworker is no big deal. Maybe your boss, you're in a very small company and you're a very close-knit company with your boss, with your coworkers. Everybody kind of just works together. There's very limited hierarchy. Maybe a text message is fine between one another. If you are in the corporate world, likely they're going to respect emails a lot more, and you're going to have to structure that email with that greeting, signing off on your emails respectfully, those sorts of things. Also, guys, you might consider multiple channels. So for instance, if you can't meet face-to-face, you might set up an email requesting a face-to-face meeting. Maybe you have a face-to-face meeting and then you follow up with an email so that you have a record of the conversation, right? So sometimes using multiple channels and reiterating that message several times is very beneficial. But always, I think, going back to that tone and what tone the channel itself sends in society today is very important, even when considering even prior to considering what content you are going to send in your message. All right, guys, next we're going to talk about the difference between formal and informal communication networks. All right, so in thinking about formal communication networks, our text defines these formal networks as systems designed by management that dictate who should communicate with whom to get the job done. And we often use these organizational charts to help visualize that chain of command. Okay, so for instance, maybe this is a CEO, maybe these are managers, maybe these are assistant managers, and maybe these are sales reps. And then we use either upward or downward communication depending on the culture of that company perhaps, or maybe the situation within that company to dictate who speaks to whom. So for instance, if you have downward communication, that's where the CEO is sending out procedures, change in rules, mass emails within the company, those kinds of things. So coming from the top down to the bottom of the chain of command. So types of downward communication, such as job instructions, job rationale, procedures and practices, feedback, and indoctrination. So I'll let you look into those definitions in your text, but just knowing that it's going to come, again, from the top down. That's downward communication. Upward communication is the opposite, so coming like from those sales reps up to the CEO. Again, working through that chain of command. So first, the sales rep is going to have to talk to the assistant manager to the manager, and then the manager to the CEO. But still, that information is coming from the very bottom to the very top of the chain of command within that company. So perhaps these messages might include what the subordinates are doing, so what those sales reps are doing, unsolved work problems, so maybe the people on the ground are having a lot of issues that the CEO doesn't necessarily see, and that needs to work its way up through the chain of command to the CEO. Maybe the assistant manager is able to solve the problem and the CEO doesn't need to be bothered, for instance. Unsolved work problems we talked about, suggestions for improvement. So again, those people on the ground are the ones doing that day-to-day work, and the CEO is managing the company, right? So these people at the bottom might have suggestions for improvement, and especially like with things with technology that could help the company, right? So maybe they make those suggestions to the assistant manager and it goes on up. How subordinates feel. So the work culture is very important, and it's very important to the CEO as well, but often the sales reps don't see the top dog very often, so it has to work its way up, again, upward communication. There's also horizontal communication, guys, and our text defines horizontal communication, sometimes called lateral communication, and this is between people, divisions, or departments that would be considered on an equal level. And so oftentimes you're going to bounce ideas off of one another and really work within your section of the company, right? And so horizontal communication, I think, almost always couples this upward and downward communication, because you're always talking with others in your communication, in your level of hierarchy at the company, right? And then information as needed is passed either up or down within the company. So the purposes of horizontal communication. So task coordination, maybe you're working in teams or groups, problem solving on a specific issue you might be tackling, sharing information, such as if you have a new hire or something like that, conflict resolution, and building rapport, because we know that that social communication is very important, right, even in the professional environment. All right, then we can talk about informal communication networks. Okay guys, so a major difference between informal communication networks and formal communication networks is with those formal communication networks, the flow of communication is decided upon by management, and with informal communication networks, not necessarily the case. Okay, so this is like your personal networks, shared proximity, shared interests, those kinds of things. So you might be more likely to talk to somebody that has the same career aspirations as you within the company, that has the same outside interests, or maybe even just the person that whose desk is right next to yours or office is right next to yours is who you chat with the most on a day-to-day basis. So the functions of informal messages, informal networks, is confirming those formal messages. So you might pop into your next door neighbor's office and saying, oh, was our meeting at 1:30 or 2 today? I just wanted to double check, right? And that's just a quick little message that you can go ask informally to your partner, right? Expanding on formal messages, so you might clarify a procedure or really work through and make sure that you understand what is expected of you at an upcoming meeting, those kinds of things. Expediting formal messages, you might learn about openings within the company that aren't maybe posted externally yet. So you might get a leg up there with these informal communication networks as to opportunities within your company or at your job, right? Contradicting official messages, so you might learn that what is said to be very important in the company might slide a little bit more than you think. Maybe deadlines aren't firmly set in stone and you have a little bit of leeway, and you learn that from your partners, perhaps people that have been at the company a little bit longer than you have, right? Circumventing formal channels, so maybe you play tennis with the guy that does the printing at a newspaper, for instance, and you can go to him and say, hey, can you rush this in? I'm a little late on this. And he'll go ahead and do that rush copy job for you and kind of let you jump to the front of the line. So that's an example of circumventing those formal channels. Using these communication networks help you to cultivate your personal network. So again, this is where our personal and professional sometimes bridge a little bit. So you want to view everyone as a prospect for your personal network. You want to be sensitive to personal and cultural factors, and you want to treat contacts with gratitude and respect. So basically, everyone you meet has something to offer you, and everyone has some tidbits of information, other connections, other friends that are going to widen your network. Also, always knowing that what you see on the outside of a person might not necessarily be everything that you need to know. So you still need to be very sensitive, give people a chance to explain. The book isn't always, or the cover doesn't always tell you everything in the book, right? So we want to be sensitive to personal and cultural factors whenever we meet new people, right? And we want to treat contacts with gratitude and respect, of course. In terms of also cultivating these personal networks, we too want to be helpful in other people's networks. So we want to help others, we want to get referrals to secondary sources, and we really need to seek a mentor. So we'll talk about seeking a mentor a little bit more here. So remember, when we are cultivating these personal networks go beyond being sociable, right? We have a desired goal. We're doing this networking for a purpose, right? We want to advance our career, meet new people, kind of expand our web, right? So then when you seek a mentor, we want this person to be who you want to be in the future, right? And you're going to pick their brain as much as you can and learn everything possible from them. One thing that our text cautions us of is keeping our mentor relationship very professional. They're not an emotional crutch per se, but really focused on the task at hand and the career objectives that both of you are trying to facilitate, right? Okay, so then we're going to move on to ethical dimensions of communication, kind of piggybacking off of the ethical way to go about seeking a mentor and learning from a mentor. So ethical dimensions of communication, and we're going to talk about utilitarian approach, rights approach, common good approach, virtue approach, professional ethic, and the publicity test. Guys, I really think our text breaks this down well for us here in distinguishing between these ethical dimensions. And this is on page 24. So the utilitarian approach, you ask yourself, does this action provide the greatest good for the greatest number? So you're always analyzing that with your communication, deciding your channel, deciphering which tone you want to apply in that channel, which tone that channel implies with the message, all that. So thinking about that, am I providing the greatest good to the greatest number with this message through this channel to these people? And the rights approach, does this action respect the moral rights, truth, privacy, non-injury promises of everyone? So you're always going to do your best to make sure that you respect the moral rights of everyone involved in any communication setting. The common good approach, does this action further the common or community good? So always we'll have these instances where we get frustrated and we want to just immediately reply to an email, so you type out your response. I challenge you there to let that sit in that draft, utilize the delay there, that asynchronous communication where you can go back and reread. And I challenge you to really think about this in those instances. Does this action further the common or community good? Professional ethic. How would an impartial jury or of your professional peers judge this action? So always going back to how do others view the message. I skipped virtue approach, Does this action promote the development of moral virtue, character in me and my community? And then lastly, guys, the publicity test. Would you be comfortable having the public learn about your behavior in the broadcast or print media? So you, again, going back, how you respond, how you structure your message, what channel, how it's received, how it's going to be received, how you anticipate it being received. Would you want all of that broadcast to everybody else? Would you want your parents to know, your siblings to know, your best friends to know, the general public at large? So double checking yourself with these ethical dimensions of communication at every step, and knowing that your communication is very important and it can be what makes or breaks your career truly. So I'm excited to jump into Chapter 2 with you guys next week. Please let me know if you have any questions and take your quiz for Chapter 1. Thanks.